On behalf of Brian and myself, I'm honored to acknowledge that we are currently recording on the traditional land of the Anishinaabe. The Anishinaabe include the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. CFS Counseling and Wellbeing and United Way Simcoe Muskoka respect Indigenous history and culture and are dedicated to moving forward in the process of reconciliation with all First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people.
Welcome to Resilience Rising, the show that shatters poverty myths, sparks optimism, and fuels innovative change through community-inspired discussions. We are so excited to be launching our second season of Resilience Rising, which is now being recorded at our new studio home at Rogers TV in Barrie. Thanks to the good folks here at Rogers, they've been so amazing to work with. This season, we will be exploring the intersectionality of poverty and the many faces of poverty within our community. We'll be looking deeply in a series of episodes into intimate partner violence and how that impacts poverty, poverty from a BIPOC perspective, and then also looking at it from an age perspective, both on the youth end as well as with older adults.
And we're so excited to be back. I'm Amanda Fellows, the Manager of Community Programs at CFS Counseling and Wellbeing.
And I'm Brian Shelley, the Chief Executive and Philanthropy Officer at United Way Simcoe Muskoka.
And we're excited for today's episode. Today we're talking about intersectionality and poverty, understanding the compounding impacts. Intersectionality has been a buzzword describing relative privilege and oppression across the many social identities that each of us hold. Scholar Kimberlé Crenshaw introduced the term in 1989. Today we'll unpack what that means in Simcoe County in 2024 with our guest, Irina Posgay-Jones, the Director of the Child, Youth, and Family Coalition of Simcoe County. Welcome to Resilience Rising, Irina. Thanks for kicking us off.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So in addition to being the Director at the Coalition, Irina, you're also a fellow with the Social Innovation Department at Georgian College, and you're currently working on your Master's of Design degree in Strategic Foresight and Innovation at OCAD.
Yes.
That's awesome. You got a lot on your plate right now.
It's busy.
Yeah,
yes,
well,
it's busy.
Thank you so much to fitting us in, because you're juggling a lot of balls, but certainly you bring a really interesting perspective, specifically with your role with the coalition, but also I know that you've worked as a volunteer with United Way over the years. Yep. Certainly your role with Georgian College. You are so connected to so many different organizations within our community and understand the work being done. So again, thank you.
Thanks for being here. So I know we talked a little bit, or in the intro, we talk about intersectionality. I think it's probably relevant to start today's episode off and for the podcast series, kind of explaining to folks what intersectionality really means.
Especially because we have a goal to be a jargon-free zone, right? So we want the folks at home to understand what we're talking about. Yep. And again, the whole idea of intersectionality of poverty is absolutely sector jargon. So if you could help us break that down, that'd be an amazing way to start.
Yeah, I'll start with a bit of a kind of a textbook example or definition, and then kind of break that down a little bit. So Amanda, as you mentioned, intersectionality, the study of overlapping or intersecting social identities and the related systems of oppression, domination, or discrimination. So when we think about the concepts of intersectionality, let's think about how we as humans define ourselves. What are some characteristics when we put ourselves into different categories? So for example, based on our gender, our race, our sexual orientation, religion, even age. So when we look at those kind of categories, where are they intersecting each other, and how do they relate to someone's experience of poverty, for example? So I like to think of kind of two examples in a sense. One, if anyone's familiar with the Wheel of Power. I know it could be considered jargony, but
if we break it down, it's okay.
If we're going to break it down, yes. So when we consider the Wheel of Power, if anyone's done exercises around that kind of scope, it looks at actually those different categories of, again, social constructs as humans, and identifying, okay, if whatever I identify with my gender, does that give me more power, or is that an aspect of my identity where I may not have as much power as other people? So the wheel is actually a wheel with different slivers, and you can start to identify, where do I have power, where do I have privilege, and how do I approach both my professional life and personal life around that aspect. So when you start to think of the intersectionality, if there's areas of that wheel where I don't have power, think of that as compounding, though. It could be one area, it could be multiple areas. So that identifies how much power we sometimes don't have. And so someone experiencing poverty, even in a temporary situation, they don't have as much power, they don't have as much access to resources, and that's compounding their experience.
And I think that's really interesting, right? Because I think this can be triggering for folks because they will say, well, so Brian is cisgender, white, male, born into middle class parents, but that doesn't mean that with all of those points of power or privilege that I'm susceptible from poverty. Certainly we know that there are people with my same lived experience that can experience and do experience poverty. So maybe if you could just explain that, right? Because it's not so much that it defines who experiences poverty, but it's I guess, is it the likelihood of someone experiencing poverty?
I wouldn't say it's necessarily the likelihood, because obviously, the experience of poverty is so subjective. It's based on a person's circumstances. It's based on things that could happen to them that are totally unexpected. But I think to your point, Brian, around your background and when you consider that wheel of power, it's more how you would react to an experience that might lead you to poverty. So for example, what you just named, I have a lot of the same privilege and power around that wheel. So, but if something happens in my life that I'm now in a situation where I am in an experience of poverty, I still understand the systems that are going to surround me, the resources I might have to lean on to then how I'm experiencing and reacting to that situation. So for someone who, if they, looking around that wheel again, if they don't have that power and privilege to start with, they don't have as many resources to then react to their experience of poverty. So it becomes more of a challenge for them to be able to lean into different supports that are available to then help them in that situation.
So would it be almost though that there are also risk factors though? So maybe not likelihood to, but could be risk factors to experiencing poverty?
I don't know if it would be so much risk factors either. I think it's more how they're reacting then to when they're having that experience.
So the idea being that these inherent dimensions of power or privilege help. It's really about system navigation and connection. Okay.
Yep.
Okay, I understand.
And some of them, to just go back to and some of those, they could be risk factors. And if they are, again, the segments of the wheel, if they have more than one of those factors, it's compounding. Right. So it could trigger, or it could slide them into those experiences, that experience. Yeah.
I think that's why we're looking, why the podcast, the TV show, looks to highlight so many of those intersecting identities, right? Related to age, related to race, related to situational things like intimate partner violence, because I think it's important to unpack those more. You are the director of the coalition, and maybe for folks who don't know what the coalition is, we should start with what is the coalition, and what is the purpose of the coalition within the county?
Yeah, for sure. Great starting point too, because the coalition has been around as a group, as a network for about 25 years, and it is a network model of organizations. We have about 40 members right now. And we come together as a group of service providers in Simcoe County, with some of those agencies extending services into Muskoka as well. So it's a network approach, and it's a range of different service providers across the county. When I think of the coalition, I kind of think of two tiers to it, almost like two ways of looking at it. One is those 40 or so individual agencies and organizations. We have one member representative from each of those organizations that attend our coalition meetings. So they're there as a member representative for that organization. We're also a collective. So as an entity, the coalition is that network of 40 voices, essentially. So we're there as a coalition to support each other from an agency perspective. So when you think of different nonprofits in the community, we're looking at common things like governance, training opportunities, advocacy opportunities, but then also as a collective, as one voice of 40 agencies, what can we be doing collaboratively across the region to then support the social issues that are happening?
And it's really interesting, we're talking about intersectionality, knowing some of the agencies that make up those 40 members. You do have organizations that are working in the sphere of the LGBTQ2 plus population. You have people working with children, youth in transition. You have organizations working with BIPOC communities. You have, and everything in between.
And they've obviously, this is a bit off planning, but when the coalition in and of itself has obviously identified poverty many times over as a resounding issue, something that spans across all the organizations and the work they're doing, because they also have offshoot advocacy groups or working groups like the Poverty Reduction Task Group, right? So it's clearly been something that's come up that they're looking to address more intentionally.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and to your point, Brad, yes, absolutely. And Brian, to your point about some of the agencies represent various groups, like various population groups in the community, and some of the service agencies that are part of the coalition provide services, more universal services,
sure.
but are still impacted. Some of their clients, some of the people that they're providing service to, are absolutely affected by poverty. That is something that we're seeing across the board in the community, right? So that's what makes the coalition as a diverse entity, because those various aspects, those various sectors are represented, and we're able to come together collectively and understand what are the issues of poverty, both as a community, but then also as representatives of individual organizations.
So we've discussed how the coalition brings together diverse groups to catalyze change within the community, and I will want to point out to the viewers and listeners at home, I have never used the word catalyze before, and so that was my moment. How has this collaborative approach helped you gain a more comprehensive understanding of intersectionality of poverty?
So I think it's those various voices coming together across the different sectors, right? So as I said, because there's such a range, we've got mental health agencies, we've got education, we've got community safety, coming together collectively, and they can share their experience within their own agency, within their own areas of expertise. But then with that range of voices around the table, we can discuss it more from various perspectives and come up with a better, deeper understanding of it because of those collective voices. And if an agency is supporting families in this way, how can other agencies, also complement that support without duplicating or stepping on each other's toes?
Well, and that's a big thing we hear. Certainly United Way as a funder in the community, this whole idea of duplication of service, right? And so any opportunities for not just networking, but also for collaboration, how we can bring together organizations to address complex needs, as opposed to having 5 or 6 organizations dealing with this in isolation, to have organizations creating this table where organizations can come together to find opportunities for collaborative is so important, because we know that we can go further when we work together.
Yep, absolutely. And those opportunities for collaboration too, they sometimes come up through, say for example, grant opportunity.
Sure.
So if you've got one agency identifying this grant opportunity, that's amazing. But what if that agency also partners with 2 or 3 other agencies who provide, a scope of services that can complement and align to? All of a sudden that application for that grant becomes even stronger because you've got a partnership amongst a number of organizations.
Yeah, I mean, and certainly, again, going back where my United Way hat, that's the model we've moved to completely, right? I mean, we had funded an incredible project with CFS over the past three years that launched the Youth Call initiative, right? And that was bringing together partners to address a really complex issue in South Simcoe.
Yeah, which ultimately, at the end of the day, helps the community. Like, it not only helps organizations to share resources when resources are often scarce, in the nonprofit sector, but it also, at the end of the day, helps families and people and community members to navigate the system more effectively, but also understand, coming back to that piece you talked about at the beginning around privilege and how we respond to things, collaboration helps us to help people who maybe don't have that privilege in being able to respond to things, to understand their resources, know where to go, maybe be able to navigate that a bit easier. Yeah, at a time when poverty is a really big issue across the country, right, where people
across
are struggling.
Across the country, across North America.
Yeah, people are really struggling.
Yeah.
So how does the coalition incorporate an intersectional approach in advocacy work or program implementation to address poverty among youth and families in Simcoe County?
I'll start off by saying, obviously it's not easy work, right? Like there's a lot of families struggling, understand that, and then also the agencies and staff that are providing support and services to people, it's hard work, right? So one of the things that I think the coalition does really well is provide this trusting and supportive environment amongst the service providers to be able to come together and start off deeply into conversations that are hard. And you used a word earlier, Brian, around they're triggering, right? They can be very triggering for folks. So part of the coming together and building this really supportive and trusting environment to be able to have these hard conversations, to be able to identify opportunities, I think is one of the benefits of the coalition for sure. We also provide an opportunity for different partners to come in and be part of this work. We've got, as I said, we've got 40 different agency partners, so they're approaching this work from various perspectives, so coming together to be able to identify what are the strengths of my agencies, where might I need support, where can I partner. So it's a jumping off point, right? For when you're looking at agencies coming together for the first time, they need to spend some time building that trust, having that rapport, this understanding of what each other do, like what are the services they provide. Yeah. So in this case, the coalition we jumpstart that getting to know you phase, and be able to jump into those. Hey, there's a grant. Let's work together. Hey, there's an opportunity. Let's work together. And we can provide that environment for agencies.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that intentional work being done by the coalition. That's really great. What about, I think it's important to talk about like the forms of discrimination, especially because we're going to, really unpack some of that in a couple of the episodes. When we look at the forms of discrimination that affect specific intersectional groups, so like racialized folks or racialized single mothers, 2S LGBTQ youth, immigrants, people with disabilities, what are some of the unique barriers or forms of discrimination that you see, or the coalition has identified, or whatever that looks like?
Yeah, this is a great question. One of the things that I would say is that a lot of times people are expected to work in a system that they're not set up to work inside. Like the system is actually designed against them in some cases, right? So for example, we talked about, and I've heard other guests on your show talk about where poverty can be defined as a lack of resources. So, for us, we work in the system, so we have this inherent knowledge of the system, right? But what if you don't have a knowledge of this system of supports that is available in the community? For example, if someone identifies that they're looking for some financial supports, where do they go? Do they know which agencies can provide them with those financial supports? If they do have that knowledge, do they know how to apply? If they're handed a form, do they know how to read that form? Do they know how to interpret some of the questions on that form? Right? Those are kind of things that in a system, the way systems are set up right now, they're not always useful or they're not always designed in a way that can really support people who need them at the time that they need them. So I think that's one of the challenges definitely that we've heard. And again, just to go back to how coalition can support that, when we're hearing those challenges, we can, coalition members and agencies can take that back into their own organizations to make sure that the supports and the systems are there for people.
So we've talked a lot about the coalition, the work they do there. I mentioned in your intro that you wear lots of different hats, and I wonder if we just shift a little bit and talk a little bit the Future of Belonging project or partnership. It's a partnership between the YMCA of Simcoe Muskoka and Georgian College, which is now actually the award-winning Future of Belonging Collaborative, right? And what if you speak to that, and how is that addressing, if it is, this idea of the intersectionality of poverty?
Great segue, great prompt, because it absolutely is. Yeah, so the Future of Belonging, just a bit of background, it has been led so far by the YMCA, Simcoe Muskoka, and Georgian College Department of Social Innovation. They've been doing some great work. They're about just over a year into this, and over this last year have been spending a lot of time working directly and listening to voices that are traditionally marginalized and often don't have a chance to be part of the system. So have done specific workshops with LGBTQ people from that audience, and also for newcomers and immigrants, students, international students at the college. So really having an understanding of, when we're talking about the system of services, really having an opportunity to hear from voices directly and inform the information that then we're as agencies taking and being able to support. So making sure that we're listening to those voices. So to my earlier answer is, we have a system of supports that sometimes people don't feel they're set up in, but now this project is giving voices and giving a chance for voices to speak, to have input into the system and how we're designing and redesigning that system.
So is that what the goal is? This is new for me, the Future of Belonging project. I hadn't heard about that before. So is the goal of it then to provide directive to community organizations or to like to who in terms of
Yeah.
how we shift or change like service delivery policy, like what's the
Yeah, what's the
end
outcome?
goal?
Yeah. So one of the outcomes is to develop a community innovation council here within Simcoe County. So give an opportunity for conversations around innovation. How can social service agencies continue to support a community innovation approach and continue to be relevant in this changing ecosystem and dynamic community that we live in, right? So for example, how can agencies respond using innovative methods to support both their delivery of services and how they're engaging with their service audience, the people who are using their programs and services. So this Community Innovation Council, the intent is for different people within community to come together and help guide those opportunities for innovation. So organizations can really support their inner operations, but then also remain relevant in the community and how they're responding to changing needs. So,
Oh, that's really interesting. I like that.
Yeah.
It's nice because I feel like, although often well-intentioned, those kind of like voices of lived expertise, we always have to be careful about how we manage that, like from a very tokeny perspective, like ensuring that,
Or exploitive.
Or exploitive, totally. And so I like the idea that this is, it sounds much more meaningful, and that I imagine if you develop this council, it remains ongoing, right? Like this work is not something, it's not project-based work. It's not going to start and then stop, with a document. It's going to be this kind of, if you're wanting these things to remain relevant, or you want organizations to remain relevant and responsive, then this is ongoing work forever, hopefully.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the intent of this Community Innovation Council is that it's co-designed with community as well. It's not intended to be another committee that, it's a closed invitation to join this committee. We're moving into a co-design approach to this, and getting input from a lot of different community members, including the coalition, to really understand how can we be intentional, how can we continue to be relevant, and support the work. Because let's be honest, people, and I know it's the title of your show, is people are resilient, agencies are resilient, but so innovation is happening in the community. We know it's happening, we've seen it, but how can we be more intentional about that? How can we come together around that work as well and support each other and really ensure an ecosystem of innovation from the perspective of social and community service partners?
I love that.
I mean, and kudos to the Y and Georgian College for taking on that role, because I don't think that this work that you're speaking to is what people would traditionally think of the role of those two organizations playing, and really speaks to those organizations stepping up and trying to be catalysts of change within their community by bringing together the right partners and the right voices. That's really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely.
And an innovative way to address poverty, in a different way, right? Because we, as service providers, and I'm guilty of this, I'm a service provider, like we go to these places of like, well, I'm going to create a program, or I'm going to do this, I'm going to just do these things, which again is well-intentioned, with this goal of being responsive to an emerging community need, but it doesn't necessarily get to the root of anything, right? So then when you're talking about this project, I'm thinking, wow, like this is a great opportunity to start to get to the root of some of this, and then maybe address it in a different way, which I think, that's a great, I just really like it. That's cool.
I love what you just said, because you're right, service providers are busy being service providers, right?
Yeah.
Like they're responding to need in the community that they're seeing, and rightly so, absolutely. And I think one of the intentions of this Community Innovation Council is to carve out some space and make it okay to look a little more broadly across the system, and have those intentional conversations. So I think that's a really important piece.
Yeah. And informed by lived expertise. I just want to highlight that, because I think I know you've said that, but I think that's the key piece, right? Because if I'm a service provider and I'm like, oh, I'm going to meet a need, I'm going to create a program, it isn't necessarily a directive or information based on what people who are living in that situation really think they need. It's what I think they need, which comes from a totally different intersection, anyway, go on.
Irene, I think what a great first guest you've been for us to try to spark this conversation. Before we wrap things up, I do have one last thought that I'm going to ask you for. This is your mic drop moment, but we're going to be wrapping our episodes this season with one last thought. So based on your experience, what advice would you give to policymakers and community leaders about adopting a more intersectional lens when addressing poverty and its related issues? It's a mouthful.
I have to, one?
Yeah. Well, we got time.
Okay, okay. I would start, and it's kind of building off your point, Amanda, it's understanding that even the best intentioned policies or directives or programs may have unintended consequences, right? So understanding the work that we do, taking more of a systems approach to it, right? So we may be coming in as experts within a certain sector or a certain domain or a certain program or service, but understanding that as we're delivering that, it's not happening in a vacuum. So let's consider this from a broader perspective. And you also mentioned, yes, including people who will be using the services, right? So understanding how can we design these programs and services from a really inclusive, accessible perspective, understanding what does that actually mean, and engaging with different voices to really bring diverse perspectives to the work that we're doing, whether it's in planning stages or implementing, or even after we've implemented. Let's evaluate this. Are we doing what we thought we wanted to do, what we intended to do? What are some of the implications that are coming out of this work? So I think it's really that, is understanding, trying to look at things from more of a systems approach, a broader community perspective, rather than just from a specific one program or service. And I think service partners are absolutely having those conversations. So really that would be, if I had to pick one,
Okay,
that would be one.
Pick two. Do you have another?
Sure. I think it's being willing to really have these hard conversations, right?
Yeah.
Like these are not easy topics, they're deep topics.
Yeah.
We're talking about power and privilege, and sometimes in order to really approach this from an equitable or an equitable lens, is sometimes we actually have to be willing to give up a little bit of that power, right?
Sure.
To be able to move forward in a truly, authentically equitable way. So sure, I mean, I might check off a lot of the boxes around that wheel of power and privilege, but am I truly willing to give up some of my power to make sure that I'm fostering positive, inclusive environments? And those aren't easy conversations. So. I think that's a bit of a challenge for folks too. Is let's be willing to talk about the hard things. I may not say all the right words all the time, but I'm willing to learn as I go as well. So
Yeah, thanks for that.
What a wonderful way to wrap our first episode and really set the stage for the next 7 episodes of Resilience Rising. As I said before, we will be looking at the intersectionality of poverty over the coming weeks, coming episodes. And none of these are easy conversations. They are all going to be, I assume they will all be challenging conversations for us. But you're right, we aren't going to move forward as a society in helping those folks and supporting those folks and helping move people from poverty to possibility unless we start having those conversations and engaging people in the conversations who are experiencing some of these difficulties.
Yeah.
Thank you, Irina, for joining us today. Irina is the Director of Children, Youth, and Family Coalition of Simcoe County. Irina is also a Fellow of Social Innovation at Georgian College. Thanks also to our partners, our new studio partners here at Rogers TV Barrie, and I really can't thank them enough for being such great hosts. To Amanda and myself, they've been great to work with, and we look forward to working with you over the coming weeks and episodes. And of course to you, our viewers and listeners, for joining us today. In addition to being available on Rogers TV, you can also find Resilience Rising on our YouTube channels. And when I say our YouTube channels, I mean CFS Counseling Wellbeing and United Way of Simcoe Muskoka. Also, if you're looking for it in an audio format, it's accessible wherever you access your favorite podcasts. And if I may be so bold, you can go back and listen to our first season of Resilience Rising in podcast form.
We'll see you next time on episode 2 of season 2, when we discuss breaking the cycle, addressing gender-based violence, and where it starts. I'm Amanda Fellows of CFS Counseling and Wellbeing, with my co-host Brian Shelley of United Way Simcoe Muskoka, asking you to embrace innovative change to ensure our communities are great places to live for everyone. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you. Irina, that was awesome.